Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and this shorter video is to help newer mini painters with the ideas around a wet palette. At first, most painters are perfectly happy to pull paint directly from the bottle and straight onto a model, and that's a nice easy way to get your first few models painted just to see if you even like painting at all. Once you're set on becoming a world famous mini painter, you'll probably want to think about dilution, thinning paints, and mixing paints. And all of these become far easier when using a palette. You can use a hard palette or dry palette, which is just a smooth bit of plastic or ceramic surface that you can mix paints around on. Hard palettes will work just fine and give you the space to get your paints just right, and these will work great for oil paints and the like. But on a larger project, these will quickly dry out. But I want to suggest if you're using water-based acrylic paints, you at least try out a wet palette, which is all of a whole heap more complicated in the fact that it's a plate, a sponge and paper. There are expensive wet palettes that you can buy, but I can't help but think that buying one is an entire waste of time and money when you can just make one with scraps from your kitchen that will work just as well, or maybe even better, than a purchased one. So let's build a 1:1 scale replica of my very first wet palette that I built to test if I thought the wet palettes were even a thing. And the first ingredient is some no-brand tube of crisps. You may already have one of these to hand, and you can of course buy a branded one if you're like rich or something. We only need the cover on the top, however, and the rest can be turned into terrain, and I guess you can eat the contents if you like. Next we need something porous to hold onto water for us, which is a fancy way of saying a sponge or kitchen roll. And finally, the important top surface that paint will sit on, we need baking paper, which is also called parchment paper depending on your location. This is not normal writing paper that will disintegrate when left in water, but rather a type of paper that will slowly let water through over time. To build our mini wet palette, we take our crisp lid, turn it over to act as a little bowl, tear out some kitchen paper and lay it flat inside, and the same with some baking paper on top. Pour a little water onto the kitchen paper and try not to get any directly on the top of the baking paper. And that's it, we have built our mini wet palette. So what's it all for? Paints in the pot from almost all brands of mini painting paints will be quite thick, and when going onto a model can leave a lumpy texture that's visible when the model is completed. To fix that, we can simply mix in a little water to the paint and it thins it down, which is an expression you might have heard already. Now we can paint the model with this thinned paint and it will go on thinner and not leave any texture. Depending on the paint type, the brand and colour, some thinned paints will require 2 or 3 coats to get a solid colour, but this is still a benefit as it's not leaving any of that texture, even after so many layers. I recommend that you play around and test this sort of wet palette for a few models just to see how it affects the paint and how it affects the way that you paint, your painting style. When I made my first tiny wet palette, I used it for about 10 models before I realised that this is the way I want to go and I should upgrade. So that means buying one, right? Nope, not even slightly. Our baking paper is still the perfect paper, but really I wanted more space. So if we increase the size of our bowl from the lid of the crisp packet to, say, a chocolate box, then we can have a lot more space and some chocolate. This is my wet palette that I've been using for nearly a year now, and you can see that all the times it's slightly dried, the pigment has settled on the edge, proving its age. This palette has been in the corner of nearly every video I've made in the last year, so clearly I'm a fan and I recommend something like this as your second step in wet palette use. I'll show a little trick here for how you can get the dilution just right. As many people ask for ratios, 1 drop of this and 2 drops of that, or 50-50, 40-60, all that sort of stuff, and it's almost always completely wrong. Different types of paint, brand, colour, they will all behave differently, but the required factor in thinning paints correctly is a physical attribute, and it is very much repeatable regardless of which type of paint you're using. Here is a blob of a paint, and I'll start to add water to it. At first it's quite a paste, and as I pull it over the palette, it will stick to the surface. As I add some more water, it gets thinner and it pulls more smoothly, which is just what we want. there will come a point where it stops sticking to the paper and it pulls back. The exact point you want your paint is just before it starts pulling back. So when you get to this point, add a little bit more of the paint into the mix and you'll have it just right. When you want to go all fancy with your painting, you can put two paints next to each other on the wet palette, like a dark and a light version of the same colour, and create a mix of the two paints on the palette. You can base coat with one of these, and then as you go up the mix, paint smaller and smaller areas on your model. And this is how you do a simple layered highlight without buying 78 pots of paint. We have the perfect paper and we have plenty of space. The next thing to improve on is our little thin rag to hold the water, because it doesn't hold that much. When painting a large model, or painting over multiple days, keeping the paint on the wet palette wet and fresh for a longer period of time can be very useful. As I paint so regularly on the channel, I want to increase the quantity of water my palette can hold, and so I got these sponges for the princely sum of not a whole lot, probably £1 or something. So let's test this chocolate box with the sponge and the same baking paper as always. Holding much more water, this should last me as long as I ever want to paint. And that's the build. That's all you need to know about building a wet palette. But there might be some other things, some good advice, some niceties that I can bestow upon you for when you're expanding your painting style. One thing I found useful is to put a few spots of water on the top of the wet palette. It's an important thing to keep track of where they are so that you don't accidentally thin something way too much, but having it on the palette means that you can pull just a tiny bit of water to make fine adjustments to any mixed paint that you already have. And you may sometimes find that you've used one area for a long time that your paint suddenly thinned down way too much, and you're not sure why. Well, in this case, check the paper. I've often worn through with hundreds of brushstrokes, and it lets water flow up. I also like to keep a dry piece of paper tucked under my palette, and this allows me to remove a little bit of water from my brush to get the mixes just right, or for other techniques like dry brushing or glazing that you can learn at some point when you're ready. I mentioned that I've used this wet palette for months, and how often have I cleaned it? Well, not for months. You may find that your palette gets smelly or mouldy, and that did happen to me a few times when I first got started using plain tap water. Instead, I use water from the kettle. Mine has a fancy filter in it as well, but I'm sure that's not required. Just every time you boil the kettle, fill a little pot or ramekin with water and let it cool down before putting it into the palette. I usually let the kettle cool and use this spray can lid, and I keep this next to my palette so I can grab it and top up, or just add a spot of clean water to anything for any reason. And because of this, I've never had to put my wet palette in the fridge. I should also mention that I don't lick brushes either. I have the dry kitchen paper from that. So if you do lick brushes and your palette goes mouldy, well, you know where that came from. You may have heard that you can't use metallic paints or washes or shades or glazes on a wet palette, which is utter tosh. I'll repeat myself in saying that I've used this wet palette for months without cleaning it, and I just keep adding boiled water to it so it never dries out. I use metallics, I use washes, and I use all sorts of other things on this wet palette as well. There has been no build-up of metallic flakes or weird mediums from the different supplies. I will specify that everything I'm using is water-based and everything is acrylic paints. So if you're using oils or other things, this might not be the tool for you. And finally, I'll mention lids. When first starting, it's no big deal, just let it dry out and refresh it the next time you paint. But when you're painting regularly, a lid can keep your paints fresh when you're not painting, like overnight or when you're at work or school. However, it's important not to create a full seal, as the condensation can cause your paints to separate. Rather leave them mostly closed or cut an air hole. This lets the water flow through the paper and into the paint, and evaporate away from the paint and then leave the system without collecting anywhere. Now I'm going to go off and enjoy my new wet palette, and I hope that you enjoy yours. Have fun painting, and remember that nothing is complicated except for all of the misinformation that I have hopefully dispelled. Comment section is below for you to ask any further questions or if I've missed anything. I have a playlist of all the models I painted on the channel so you can see my wet palette in action. And with all that said, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.